Welcome back to the NIL Era podcast. My name is Elise Bien.
And I'm Fernando Andrade. And today it's all about recruiting in the NIL era. I think that the best way to paint the picture for how different things are nowadays is to start off by describing our personal recruiting journey when, I think it was like, at least for me, 6-7 years ago. I'm sure for Elise, potentially even more because the rules are different, and we'll get into that in a bit. So Elise, do you want to start us off there, how your recruiting process looked like for gymnastics?
For those of you who haven't gone through that recruiting process, it feels like $1 million decision. But in terms of my recruiting journey, it was pretty typical in terms of sending out emails with training videos and trying to schedule unofficial visits, official visits, hopping on calls with coaches. The only maybe abnormal aspect was that I was going through this process my freshman year of high school, even 8th grade, and committed my sophomore year. So I was still relatively young. Even my entire class, most of them committed in 8th grade. So back then, the gymnastics culture was very much so committing very early. Like Fernando said, rules have kind of changed where now you mostly see girls commit junior, senior year of high school, pushing that date a little bit later. But mine was pretty typical, but did commit my sophomore year of high school and never really looked back after seeing Cal and being able to experience the coaches, the team, and all that Berkeley had to offer.
Elise, just to be completely clear for anybody that hasn't gone through this process, what does the typical process look like for women's gymnastics?
For gymnastics specifically, there's kind of two rows that you can go on. One is you're either an elite gymnast, or two, you're a level 10 gymnast. That's usually when recruiting will start. And luckily for myself, I was at a pretty competitive gym where they had us go to competitive meets with a lot of eyes from college coaches who would come out to these meets and just recruit. They'd watch the level 10 session or sessions if there's multiple and kind of jot down who they're looking at. But because my gym was a pretty great gym in terms of producing a lot of D1 gymnasts, we had college coaches come into the gym a lot to watch practice. And that's when it kind of started for me. My coaches coming up to me after, specifically like Justin and Liz coming into the gym and being like, oh, they're interested in you, start sending them videos. So I would start sending them videos every single week and just trying to build a relationship. And then that's usually what happens is you try and build a relationship. You keep emailing. You even go to camps. All these programs in most sports, I know soccer does them too. They have camps and you usually tell the coach beforehand, I'm going to be at this camp, so they can kind of look out for you and put you in the group that they're kind of keeping an eye on. So there's definitely a lot of different ways, but mostly typical is seeing a practice, emails, phone calls, camps, all of that. And then you'll get to the point of visits and hopefully an offer by the end.
So pretty similar to soccer in the respect of the showcases and the specific level. So many things have changed in U.S. soccer, specifically on the boys' side. And that could be a podcast in and of itself that has nothing to do with NIL, so I won't go there. But back in my day, there was this thing called Development Academy. That was the league. It was just known as the Academy, and it was a U.S. Soccer Federation league for boys. And that's non-existent now, but pretty much what it meant back then is that there would be the top clubs got access to an academy. It was MLS clubs for sure, and then the top non-MLS clubs would get access to being in this league. And there's the winter showcase, there's the summer showcase, summer playoffs, etc. And that's the easiest way to contact college coaches back in that day. Now it's pretty similar with MLS Next Pro, or just MLS Next. I'm not even sure what it's called now, but that's the same concept of once you're at a specific level, you're not playing high school soccer, you're just focused on the academy, on the MLS Next level, and all the coaches are there at these games, at these showcases. And you send highlights, you send your videos, transcripts, etc. And then you just hop on phone calls. You get an official visit at some point, and that's it. That's how it worked out for me. Pretty much, my recruiting process was extremely quick, which is not normal. Mine was like a month or two long. I picked out my favorite schools, sent them emails, eventually got on the phone with Cal, exact same reaction as you. Like, once you're at Cal, you make the visit, everything happens. You're like, yeah, I'm not saying no to this. Committed, and that was that. But I think for the context of NIL today, my decision would have been completely different had I been not only in a different sport, but in a different time. Because for the bigger revenue sports nowadays, it's not just a 1 month decision. This isn't something you can just commit to right away. And it's not even a 4-year decision. It's a life-changing decision for so many kids, because we're talking about $1 million decisions for kids that are 16 years old. And it comes to make the question, it brings us to the question of the student athlete. Is it student before athlete? Is it athlete before student? What is going on? Elise, could you explain why it's so complicated nowadays? What's going on with NIL? What does NIL have anything to do with the recruiting process today?
So for us and going through that recruiting process, what felt like $1 million decision, these 16-year-olds now are literally making $1 million decision, which is a crazy concept. So it's just adding another layer to an already stressful process. The NIL money that's behind this and that is weaved into the recruiting process is next level decision making for kids who are not even legal adults yet. So recruits out of high school are being offered unfathomable amounts of NIL packages. And as we get further into the NIL landscape, we're 3 years in, PSAs, or again, prospective student athletes, are expecting that NIL portion in recruiting. It's just part of what this is now and the time that we're in college athletics. I've heard of stories of PSAs negotiating for cold hard cash while they're on recruiting trips. It's just so embedded into the offer deals that not only like a full ride or stipend and everything like that with benefits, but it's now what else can I also get that I can't get anywhere else? So this NIL aspect is just an addition that is now so important to those top programs, to those top universities to get these top recruits. You need NIL involved in your recruiting, especially for these revenue-making sports.
A side note through that, back in our day, it would be the full ride, the stipend, everything you mentioned. But with the NIL today, what does that look like for recruiting? Is it just cash? Is it a car? Is it a house? What is involved in this recruiting money, if you will?
I think for most of the times you're seeing it through the collectives. It's these potential like NIL deals that you would do, all of that. But you see it in the media of like the cars, the houses, the private jets, the chartering of your families to every game, because that is important and that racks up a lot of money. Like that is what you're seeing in the media. But I think most of the time it is like being able to opt into an amazing collective that backs either your whole university athletic department or a specific program in your sport. But I think it's important to just imagine being in a 16-year-old like shoes. Like even for ourselves, I could not imagine. So just being like in this day and age, imagine being presented a full ride from two of the top programs in the NCAA, and then on top of that, like $100,000 NIL deal on top of it. Like which school do you choose? Do you choose the program that has the stronger academics, like we said, the student before athlete? Do you choose the program that is ranked higher? Do you choose the program that's giving you more money? Like there's just so many different aspects to this recruiting landscape now. And yes, we're 3 years in, but it changes and it's very hard to navigate because also on the other side of it, our coaches, this is the first time they're dealing with this. They are having to heavily recruit great athletes, all this stuff, but there's some things that are out of their hands. If you don't have a great collective, if you don't have that NIL experience under your belt for your program, it's such a new landscape for both recruits, student athletes, prospective student athletes, like all this stuff, and coaches. It's a crazy landscape right now.
To further understand this, we'll go into an example in a bit, but before that, could you explain how many players are involved in this game? Because you already mentioned collectives, you mentioned athletic departments, you mentioned coaches, but it's important to understand that they don't necessarily work together, and while they may be on the same side, they aren't necessarily on the same team. For example, a collective is technically not tied with an athletic department. They're two different groups, two different people, technically, right? That's what it's supposed to be. So could you explain that a bit and potentially how that could cause an issue for coaches as well?
So it's really funny actually because that's something people don't realize is most donors, it's your donors are either supporting you as a student athlete or they're supporting a program. And it's like, yes, you're giving back to your university. That's kind of the umbrella term. But within that, it's either individual student athletes, you want to give cold, hard cash to your student athletes through NIL deals, or you want to help support a program. So what a lot of athletic departments are facing right now is that top donors are giving cold, hard cash in whatever deal to collectives to give to student athletes. And that is supporting the program. You're going to be able to get more recruits probably that way. You're going to make your student athletes on your team more happy. Like that is supporting a program. But on the other side of it, what if you need a new facility and you need these donors to donate to your program? So you have enough fundraising money to now get a new gym, a new whatever equipment, whatever that is. But if these donors are going straight to the collective, you are having a problem as an athletic department trying to get these donors to also give money in both places. So it's a very hard relationship, I think, because you need both. I think now you have great programs. A facility, a top-notch facility is probably going to sway you a little more in that direction. But then if the other school has a better collective, like what are you going to do? So I think in the future, especially now with the house settlement, I think there's going to be a lot more conversation of whether or not collectives are going to not really sit in athletics, but if it's going to have some sort of place, I think, in an athletic department. I don't really know how that's going to work, but I think that is kind of the conversation of the relationship between an athletic department and collective.
So that's all in theory. That's how it works. Let's paint a picture for what it's looking like in practice nowadays. Let's take top programs, the best facilities in the nation. Everything is already set. And then what does it come down to? I even think there was a UNC basketball example that was just on a podcast, right? Did you see that clip?
So I think in another aspect of collective athletic department, it's also the brand of an athletic department. So for top programs, top student athletes, top revenue-making sports, like you just said, a UNC basketball program, men's basketball, huge, like a dynasty in college athletics. It's something that we're in a time and place where it's no longer just about the education for student athletes. It's about so much more. And I think that's part of this nuanced conversation of it depends on where you're at. What sport are you? What program are you at? It's a very niche, I think, conversation. But like you said, there was a UNC basketball player, Armando Baycott, and he was just on Paul George's podcast. And he revealed that he was given, quote unquote, life-changing money in college off playing basketball. So he went on this podcast and said he earned more than $2 million during his 5 years at UNC. And that was just 2 years in which was before passing of NIL, because he came in and NIL wasn't a thing yet. So this is really important because Armando went undrafted in the 2024 NBA draft, so the draft that just happened. But of course, he's an amazing athlete. Like that's without saying. Like he's a UNC men's basketball player. Like he's amazing. But he wasn't a first rounder. He did just get picked up and signed, but he wasn't technically drafted. So you're looking at this example and this life-changing money, and then you're like, how does that happen? Now you look at the legacy of a program like UNC men's basketball. It brings support and a brand excellence that people support. The NIL of UNC as an athletic department is elite. So now kind of stepping back, pair it with Duke, and then step even further, the North Carolina market in itself and the college athletics dynasty that is UNC and Duke, these two schools are instrumental to the conference, to the ACC. So all of that, it just all connects with one another. And that's why it's so much more than just you go and you do calls and you do recruiting trips, all of that. It's quite literally a $1 million decision that these young recruits are making. And it's, how do you navigate that landscape? How are you supposed to be aware of life-changing money that could come out of your college career? It's a very complicated topic that I would not be able to navigate if I was going through this again alone, knowing what I know and what I went through. Like, that is a difficult decision.
I think it's also important to recognize how this will impact sports and the NCAA as a whole. For example, you just mentioned Armando, and he was in college basketball for 5 years, which is not necessarily normal for somebody that's going to go off and play in the NBA from college, right? Like, sure, first rounders are typically one and done, but then you start comparing the business numbers from men's basketball in college to women's basketball in college. And what was the main difference? The women's basketball players had a rivalry. So we knew that there was a little thing going on in the headlines between a Caitlin Clark, for example, and an Angel Reese. That's because they stayed playing college basketball for more than a year. You can create these rivalries, you can create these headlines because they've been there longer. And the main reason people are now choosing to stay in the NCAA longer is because of the NIL money. And I think that's going to be a huge decision for many revenue athletes to make, because you could go play pro, or you could stay in the NCAA and make either the same or even more money than you would be making as a pro. I think a great example, once again, is Caitlin. Like, you look at what her salary is or her contract versus what her pro NIL salary is, and it's completely different. And I think that's something that we'll start seeing maybe in all revenue sports, but even beyond that, I think some big names outside of revenue sports will start having these impacts. We could look at some of the Olympians that are going to swimming, some of the Olympians that are in track and field. They will start making X amount of money that's just completely different to what they would make as a pro, and then could carry that on afterwards. But to stick to the topic for now, I think that it's important to understand that while you can stay in the NCAA because of this money, that means a lot of things. It doesn't mean that you stay at the same school and on the same team, because of course, when we're talking about NIL recruiting nowadays, something that's changed as well is that we have to talk about the transfer portal. They're a dynamic duo right now in college athletics, and that's something completely different to when we committed as well. Because back in our day, to washed up the athletes here, back in our day, thing wasn't this big of a deal. I'm sorry, not the recruiting, the transferring thing wasn't this big of a deal. I only had one transferred teammate. That was it in all my 4 years. Like, it just wasn't much of a thing, but now it totally is. So what does this look like, and what role does NIL play in the transfer portal in 2024?
It is very important to realize this dynamic duo, like you said, of recruiting from NIL, all of that, and the transfer portal. So for those of you who don't know, the passing of the one-time transfer rule went into effect April of 2021. And that was monumental for most of these revenue-making sports. So it gave every student athlete who was academically eligible the ability to transfer to another institution and not sit out the following season. And this was really groundbreaking because previously the sports of football, men's basketball, women's basketball, ice hockey, and baseball had to sit out a year before playing if they wanted to transfer. So when you saw this one-time transfer rule go into effect, there was an influx of transfers. You were able to move institutions and not really serve a quote-unquote penalty anymore. So that kind of we saw just so many people transfer, and that was kind of the new hot thing of you can rebuild your roster with a bunch of new guys. Like you saw Deion Sanders do it at CU Boulder. He basically recruited an entire new team out of the transfer portal. And even now, as of April 2024, it is officially an unlimited transfer rule as long as you leave your prior institution academically eligible and enter the transfer windows within that period. So now, not even a one-time transfer rule, you can transfer as many times as you want. So it proposes that question of if we're really promoting a culture of student before athlete, like we kind of mentioned before. But when you transfer more times, you inevitably lose academic credits, and it just becomes harder and harder to complete your degree. But at the same time, if you are receiving quote unquote life-changing money from different collectives, markets, etc., how could you say no to that? I think it's really interesting when you look at specifically academically rigorous Power 5 institutions. It's hard for me to believe that a lot of these Stanford student athletes would transfer from Stanford. But if like you are presented life-changing money, like how could you not? So I heard of a story of someone completing her degree and like kind of cramming her degree. So she graduated with the Stanford degree and then hopped into the transfer portal and started competing for a different program, which is like smart if you think about it. Like you got a Stanford degree, all this stuff, and then you jumped in and like competed for, I think, I'm pretty sure, a more competitive program. Like that's what you're kind of seeing is now like, which is kind of not more important, but like, well, how are you going to get it kind of around this? I think it's interesting in terms of the Ivy Leagues because the Ivy League conference doesn't really do collectives. The Ivies as a conference is not real. I wouldn't say they're like old school, but I think it's a little hard to change with the times just because it is an Ivy League. So it's now the Ivy League has amazing student athletes, specifically in men's basketball, women's basketball, but they don't have a collective that backs you. And so you don't get life-changing money. Do you jump in the portal and go to another institution that will give you that money? Or do you stay and do you get an Ivy League degree? Like that is a very difficult conversation. And I don't think there is a right or wrong answer. It's what do you want to do in that sense? Where do you see your life in 5-10 years? And what is that path? But I think that's a very, very difficult decision. And it comes from that NIL, that recruiting, that transfer portal, and it all just kind of connects.
I think that it's also important to realize that it totally depends on the personal situation of every single student athlete. It depends on what background you're coming from, where you see your future, what you value. I mean, I think this is something that's going to reveal what people value, whether it's the academics, whether it's the athletics, whether it's the money. And again, it's a big it depends question. We're not here to judge whether one is better than the other. It is a completely personal decision. But to summarize everything that we've talked about here, what is this intersection between NIL, the transfer portal, and recruiting? What is this whole thing tied up together?
So looking just at men's basketball, because I think it's a great example, the money in the transfer portal for men's basketball is next level money. A group called the Student Athlete NIL just collected data and concluded that the top 50 men's basketball transfers earned an average of $750,000 in NIL money. So the Power Four and the Big East spent 2 times the amount on transfers than the Group of 5 conferences and captured 82% of the top 200 ranked players in the portal. That is some interesting numbers just in itself of the guys they're getting and how they're just upping their program. Even specifically at Cal, we have a whole entire new team this year. Like most of our guys either graduated, their 5th years done with eligibility, or they jumped in the portal. So our head coach, Mark Madsen, had to go in the portal, have a bunch of support from their collective, their specific men's basketball collective, to get a whole new team to stay competitive in men's basketball in this landscape. So it's clear the top athletes come at an expensive price. So you must have a program and athletic department with strong NIL brand awareness to not only attract these players, but to also have enough pull to get them to put pen to paper and sign to come to your university.
And at the end of the day, it's extremely important to put all of this into perspective. We must look at what this means as a business. Having an average income for revenue-making top program athletes at $750,000 coming from NIL, that is 10 times more than the national average household income. 10 times more. That is what we're talking about, and that's going to be the biggest divide that we've ever seen before. There was already a divide between back then Power 5, now Core 4 schools, and everybody else. But now it's a full-on business year. Whoever has the best donors, the best collective, the best athletic department, that's who's going to win. And I think that this is one of the biggest threats to the NCAA. It's not only NIL, but rather the transfer portal. Because eventually, like you mentioned, if another school offers you more money, and you choose to transfer, and you keep on transferring, that's just affecting your academics as a whole, over and over and over again. So what comes first? Athletics, academics, finances? And that's a very personal decision. But the more we allow individuals to take this decision, the less power the NCAA has. And whether we like it or not, I personally believe it will lead to the downfall as the NCAA, at least to the NCAA as we know it today. But undoubtedly, I think it's the biggest threat to the NCAA today, having these decisions be made by someone that isn't them. Because it's just showing you that this is now pro sports. 10 times the average national household income is a different kind of money that we're talking about. And to call these athletes amateurs, to call them student athletes, it's just not, it's not the truth anymore.
It's such a hard thing to think about, because we're just talking men's basketball. What about the other sports, all this stuff? So it's that perspective part of things. But you're right, is specifically men's basketball, is it already too far gone for the NCAA? It's there's an analogy that is kind of used in terms of college athletics, is when you squeeze the toothpaste bottle and so much toothpaste comes out and you can't put it back in. They've let it all loose, and now it's too late to reel it back in. They're trying to. Soon they're going to vote on whether the transfer windows, if they get shrinked. Right now it's 45 days, I believe. They're trying to shrink it to potentially 30. So is that going to help with the transfer things that are happening? Because roster management right now, specifically from a coach's lens, is a lot. Recruiting right now, even for my coaches, they have kids. They're away from home. It's a lot. Yes, it's their job, but it is a lot, and they're people. So it's hard of where's the line? How do we keep this manageable? But also, is it too far gone? Who knows? Who knows?
Well, to wrap this up, I think a couple things to keep in mind. I definitely think this is something that will impact athletic departments. I definitely think there will have to be some sort of deeper relationship between collectives and athletic departments if this continues to be the case. I think it'd be extremely interesting to get the perspective of a non-Core 4 athletic department, potentially an AD, potentially somebody that works in one of those conferences. And again, in the long run, I'd love to talk to a coach how this impacts the recruiting, because so many things will change. It will start looking at somebody that deals with NIL in an athletic department, but then we will start to look at somebody that specifically deals with NIL recruiting in athletic departments. And we'll start looking at that at the revenue teams, and we'll start looking at that potentially even a specific coach within each team. So a lot of perspectives to consider. I'm sure we can talk about this off the camera, but I would love to get some guests on to learn more about this. But I think that's a great way to end for today. Don't you think?
Agreed. Thank you, everyone, for listening and sticking with us.
You can subscribe on YouTube. You can follow on Spotify. Make sure to hit up the Instagram account. It is up and running. And yeah, that's it for today. We will see you all next week.
Bye.